The focus of this presentation is going to be unit testing, specifically why you should consider using an IDE to improve your unit testing capabilities. This presentation was inspired by the No Silver Bullet essay by Fred Brooks we read in Module 1. Although unit testing in an IDE might not have a magnitude of 10 in terms of productivity, it makes a huge improvement. So much of an improvement, it really helps to encourage developers to test their code because a lot of developers will overlook the testing component of development. First off, I would like to ask you, what do you think of when you think about unit testing? Just in general, what is it? How do you use it? Is it necessary? I'm not going to pause the video, but please take a moment to think about what unit testing means to you. So, for me, unit testing is one of those umbrella activities that is a necessary part of the construction through maintenance phases of your software. Constantly testing your application will help maintain its integrity and help reduce the bugs in your system. You do not want to introduce problems when you develop new features, and you do not want to break things that are already working. IDEs will simplify the process of testing for you. This way, developers are encouraged to continue to write tests for their code and to constantly run your tests to make sure nothing is or has broken in the process of development. An IDE is going to help you integrate unit testing into your development. To start, I would like to talk about the pros and cons of unit testing in an IDE. Then we will go more in depth about each. Pros of an IDE for unit testing. It's integrated into the application. This will allow seamless transitions from writing tests to writing code to then running tests. There's guided help from the IDE. The IDE can offer suggestions when you write your tests, as well as additional tools to help debug any issues. It's easy to configure different testing frameworks. IDEs made it easier to configure your application to using a testing framework of your choice. Lastly, IDEs can identify coverage of your code. This allows the developer to see how much of the code has been covered by tests. Cons. IDEs can be resource heavy. They can use significantly more resources and potentially make running itself and other applications slow. There are environments on which they will not work. Some system constraints might not allow for an IDE to run. As mentioned previously, unit testing is integrated into the IDE, so you can seamlessly transition from writing tests to writing code and then running the test. What this means is the transitions is done all in the same application without having to move back and forth between applications. I'm going to pause the video for 5 seconds and see if you can think of one development process that would benefit from this seamless transition. 5 seconds starting now. Test-driven development is what comes to mind for me. Test-driven development in an IDE is much less complicated than not using one. You can transition from tests to code to tests all in the same application. Let me demonstrate that process briefly in an IDE and compare it to the process when you are not using an IDE. In an IDE, you go from writing tests to writing code to running tests, and then modifying your code. You do this continuously until all the tests pass and all your features are developed. Again, all this is done in the IDE. Without an IDE, you must move back and forth between applications, meaning you write tests, switch to the terminal to run the test, switch back to your text editors to write the code, and then switch back to the terminal to run the test, and then switch back to the text editor to write the code. The process is not impossible without an IDE, but as you can imagine, it's much more time consuming, especially when writing a lot of code. The IDE will also provide guided help for a lot of aspects of testing and development. The two main ways the IDE provides help is through suggestions and through a debugger. The suggestions can help you identify things like typos or just generally incomplete or inaccurate logic. The suggestions can also help get your test set up. The other way an IDE helps is with the debugger. We will not go into details, but the debugger can help you identify the issues in your code that your tests have uncovered. Without the IDE, you are a bit more in the dark about where problems in your code are. An IDE can help with configuration of your testing frameworks. I will not talk much about this, but help with configuration comes in handy. Configuring a framework into your application can be tricky and time consuming, especially if you're going to start working on an existing project that already has tests built in. With the guided help from the IDE, this will make setting up a new test environment painless, freeing you up to spend more time doing more impactful things like building features, as well as giving you more freedom to pick your testing and framework. Providing code coverage is one of the biggest advantages of using an IDE for unit testing, in my opinion. With an IDE, you can use the coverage tools to identify how much of your code is covered by your tests. Take a moment to think about why identifying code coverage is so important. Pause the video and take some time to think about why code coverage might be important. Pause the video here. Code coverage can provide valuable insights as to some of the issues you may have overlooked. What I mean is, it helps you identify conditions that you may have missed when writing your test. If there are situations that are untested in your code, you have most likely either forgot about them or don't even know they exist. Therefore, when you run into issues with your code, it might be because you probably overlooked these untested conditions. Looking at this simple code example, you can see the code coverage provides us with some potential problems with our logic that we might not have thought about. If you follow the code, you can see that the final conditional will never be met. Therefore, should we adjust the else if statement, or should we eliminate the else statement altogether? With these insights from the code coverage, you can decide how to handle each situation. As we conclude, I want to reiterate the main point that testing is important for many phases of development. We're going to briefly revisit each reason using an IDE for testing is so helpful. The seamless transition from test to code, the guided help and debugging tools, the auto configuration of testing frameworks, and tracking code covered by the test. With an IDE, testing your code can be much easier and painless. I hope after hearing about how easy it is to incorporate testing with an IDE, you're more encouraged to take the time to write tests for your code. Not all environments are set up for the use of an IDE, But if you have the option, you should really strive to make use of an IDE.